AskReddit by Toaster Synth Tub. What is the most heartbreaking thing you've ever had to tell someone? Telling my son his mother died. Worst day of my life, and certainly his also. I'm so sorry to hear that. This would be the most difficult news to break to someone, particularly coming from somebody who loves him most. How old was he, if you don't mind me asking? I had to call all of my siblings to tell them our mom had died of cancer. Then I had to call all of her friends. That was a difficult day. I'm so sorry. And yeah, that's the fucking worst, and I can relate. I had to tell my mom she had terminal cancer because they put it in her patient portal before meeting with her, and she pulled it up and asked me to read it to her. Then a year later I found her dead and had to wake my dad to tell him and all my siblings. Sorry for the trauma dump. Had to tell my mom that my wife had died. She was 28. Then I had to tell her best friend. Thankfully, the doctors told her parents. It's been 20 years and I still remember the noise her mom made. I can imagine. I watched my parents lose a child, my brother, who was ironically also 28. It's the most horrible thing I had to see. I don't ever remember my dad even crying much, and he was literally weeping that day. I had to explain to my dad, who had a progressive debilitating disease, that his family wasn't going to be able to take care of him anymore. His physical needs, lifts, transitions, etc., and medical needs were too advanced. In a week or two, he would have to move to an assisted living home. At that point, his plan to end his own life rather than die of this disease would be incredibly difficult to carry out. So while we all wanted him to go to the home and we promised he would be a big part of our lives, I had to make sure he knew that if he didn't want that, it was now or never. He chose now. Your dad is blessed to have a strong child that loved him enough to protect his autonomy until the end. Not a lot of people capable of that love. Calling my grandfather to tell him my mom passed away the night before. I had to tell my dad, who was in the hospital with a broken hip, that my sister who had cancer died. He ended up dying 6 weeks later on Christmas. When I had to tell a young boy, 8/9, that we were doing all we could for his mom. We ran a call for chest pain and trouble breathing. We got there and mom was on the floor, totally unresponsive. CPR, jumper cables, etc. She was coded, gone. I knew she was dead. The whole crew knew she was dead, but I couldn't tell him that. I had to give him false hope. Similar-ish. I was in the back of the ambulance with a guy who had been driving and hydroplaned under an 18-wheeler. He had a broken arm. His pregnant wife was in the passenger seat and the wheels of the truck ran up over her side of the car. She was 100% gone when we get on scene. But I had to spend that whole ride repeatedly telling him the other ambulance had his wife and they were going to do all they could. That call broke me and I quit EMT work shortly after. They were on their way to celebrate their first anniversary. She was about 5 months pregnant. Deleted. Damn, sorry to hear that. People are too fucking quick to post that stuff to get internet points, and a death is something you need to make sure all close family is aware of. Not nearly the same magnitude as your story, but when my wife and I told my parents we were expecting, about to get through the first trimester and it was getting harder to hide from close family, my mom's first instinct was to whip out her phone because I have to tell people. We stopped her and scolded her that it was not her news to share, and we literally didn't even have a chance to tell anyone else but my in-laws at that point. Telling my dad he arrived at the hospital too late and damp, mum died 30 minutes ago. So sad. Firing someone you know needs a job. My dad once had to fire a guy who badly needed the job. But before he fired him, my dad lined the guy up with an even better job through a connection, and the guy ended up doing well and staying with that company. Basically, my dad called the guy into his office and said, "I've got good news and bad news. Bad news is, you're fired. Good news is I found someone who'd like to hire you." My uncle was actively dying of pancreatic cancer. He had always been like a father to me, and they told me he'd been asking for me. He had been choking on water and food, so they decolored him NPO, nothing by mouth. I remember him saying if they'd let me have food or water, maybe I won't die. I knew it was a lie, but when I left the hospital that night, I told him I'd see him tomorrow. He literally died a few hours later. I had to tell my mom my dad died after she blocked out his death. She made a sound that haunts me to this day. They were married for almost 50 years. My auntie went through that with my nana. Her memory was already shot when grandpa passed, and every day she'd wake up and ask, did Joe die, and auntie would have to break it to her. Her grief stayed fresh and raw until she passed away herself. I'm so sorry you had to go through that too. I haven't had to yet, and I can't even imagine. My wife had vascular dementia and I had hospice nurses coming in every day to help care for her. She did not know she was in hospice. In a lucid moment she noticed the word hospice on someone's badge and asked me if she was dying. I told her, truthfully, that she was in hospice because I needed the extra help to wash and change her and to monitor her vital statistics, and that being in hospice did not mean she was dying. All of that was true, but I knew that she was probably nearing the end. She would have been terribly upset to know the truth. I agonized over that lie of mission, from the perspective that a person has the right to the truth about their body, life, death. I made the decision not to tell her, taking the responsibility that if it was the wrong decision, it was a decision made in love. She passed quietly 2 weeks later, at home with our son and I holding her hands, comfortable, well cared for and knowing she was loved. If you believe in some sort of afterlife, your wife now knows and understands exactly why you made that decision. If you lied because of love, she knows that it wasn't a lie, of omission or otherwise, but a decision you made out of caring and compassion. No other choice was possible. Your abdominal aortic aneurysm is inoperable and is leaking. We will continue to give you blood until your children arrive so you can say goodbye. The IQ kept my dad alive so we could say goodbye. He was pretty out of it, but his eyes changed when I sang for him, so I know he heard me. Thank you for what you did for that family. It makes such a difference. Imagine being a prison social worker and having to tell an inmate their kid was raped in foster care, or their spouse is dying of cancer but they weren't approved to be with them in their final moments, or their kid was adopted out of foster care and it's a sealed adoption so they'll never see them again and the last thing they said to them was the last thing they'll ever get to say to them. That is literally someone's job in almost every prison. Terrible stuff. People really underestimate the vicarious trauma of working with inmates. There are so many secondary and tertiary consequences of being sentenced to prison, and many people are unable to remain caring and competent in their professional roles to help them. I had to tell my then fiancé that I wasted postponing our wedding. 2 weeks before said wedding, while she sat on a hospital bed in the psychiatric ward where I'd had her involuntarily committed. I bet you felt like the devil incarnate, but you may have saved a life. You did the right thing there. He's not coming back, we have to say goodbye now. I'll never forget it. When we got called back to the IQ my dad was in, my mum asked me to run ahead and find out what was happening because she couldn't keep up with her walking cane. Kind man at the hospital doors took her dog and said he'd wait outside with her as he saw we were frantic to get inside. I hate that it had to be me to say it, but she wasn't understanding the nurses when they tried to break it gently. I never want T9 say something like that ever again. I have to tell parents the neonatal transport team are on their way and they will do everything in their power to save their baby, but it might not work and there may be lasting damage. Sometimes their cries and the things they say to their babies haunt me. As someone who's been on the other end receiving that news, thank you for everything that you do. I lived through it once, and I couldn't imagine having to experience it again and again. Thank you. That a mutual friend's son had been killed in Afghanistan. I used to live in a mobile home park with a frontage road situated behind it. A fellow resident of the park had lost her cat, prompting her to plaster missing cat posters everywhere. Unfortunately, I stumbled upon her deceased cat on the frontage road, and I knew I had to call and deliver the devastating news to her. Hearing her voice break left me feeling utterly remorseful, compounded by my fear that she might suspect me of being responsible for the accident. Eventually, my stepfather intervened, retrieving the cat, placing it in a box, and delivering it to her. The entire experience was truly heart-wrenching. I am a cat mom myself, so it hit close to home. 5 minutes after being told my brother had been killed, I had to tell my mom that her son had died. It was the worst day of my life. That is terrible and I am so sorry. I have lost a brother too, so I know the feeling. Sending you and your family hugs. Working at the airport, I had to deny entry to a woman because she had forgotten her ID. She started crying uncontrollably, as her father had an accident and was going to be taken off life support at the hospital in another state that night. There is a process to verify identity, but it takes time, and she was already late. She missed her flight. I'm so sorry. This isn't any worse than most of the others on here, but it must be a certain kind of pain to know you're the worst part of someone's life like that, when there wasn't anything you could have done differently. Hugs to you. That their HIV lab result came back positive, to a patient who had been drugged and gang raped by their father's friends. That was an awful day for everyone. Heartbreaking, but on the bright side, the life expectancy of HIV positive people is like 70 now, and it's good they caught it early so they could get the meds they needed to stop it progressing. When I was 19 and had to tell my mom that her trusted friend and neighbor, 52M, had been sleeping with me since I was 13. I'm so sorry. I had to tell my mom that my dad had passed away. In a medical setting, telling family that their loved one passed away. It's not just heartbreaking, but gut-wrenching. There was always a split second I was in their shoes. Telling family that their loved one has been suffering too long now, and will never recover is also tough.